people make stuff up, they're not willing to suffer a lot for their lie because they know that it's a lie. I've got a couple of examples there. I don't mean, I hope, if there are any Scientologists or any Mormons here, I don't mean to offend you or anything, but these are just matters of historical record, right? So we know that L. Ron Hubbard, when things started to get a bit dodgy and dangerous for him, mainly because of tax evasion and things like that, right? So what did he do? Did he stand up and say, no, you must all respect what I'm saying and listen to what I'm saying and I don't care about the consequences? No, he got paranoid and he bought a big boat and he went and lived on it for like 10 years. And then after that he went and hid in the desert on a farm or something so that nobody could find him, mostly the IRS. But, he clearly didn't have the courage of his convictions to stand up and say, what I'm doing is right and what I'm teaching is right. And of course, Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of Mormonism, famously died because of all the people who were so angry with him storming the jail where he was being held for having destroyed the offices of a newspaper that had written nasty things about him. So he went and destroyed the office, burned it down, so he got caught and put in jail, and the townspeople took things into their own hands and they stormed the jail and they killed him. What did he do? He fought back. He killed a few people on his way out, right? Is this a person who's willing to die for his beliefs? No, this is a person who got caught in telling a lie, which he probably himself, well, I shouldn't say that because we don't know, but it's possible that he himself didn't really believe it deep down, and when push comes to shove, right, then they try and find a way out of the bad situation, rather than standing up for the faith that they're teaching. And that's not what the early Christians did. Some of them even went joyfully to their martyrdom. And just think about that. People went joyfully with the people who they know are going to torture and kill them, believing that they are doing a good thing. Who does that? Someone who genuinely believes in the thing that they are dying for. Martin Luther King's anniversary of his death was recently. It's this year, I think. It was a couple of months ago or something like that. And apparently I was listening to an interesting broadcast about it, and apparently he had some premonitions that he was going to be killed. I think the security people or the police or someone had told him that there was threats and things like that. And apparently the last sermon that he preached, he gave this very impassioned speech about how willing he was to die in the name of the cause that he was fighting for. Like, that's how passionately he believed in it. And he's kind of telling people, don't be sad if I die. And I'm not going to be sad because I know that I've done the right thing and I know that what I'm doing is worth dying for. And that's really touching because that level of belief is rare in our time. There are not that many people who believe in anything so strongly that they would be willing to die for it. But when we see that, it gives us a respect for their value and their passion and their commitment to what they're doing. Which makes a deception theory of the apostles of Christ really difficult to accept. Because this is not the behaviour of, willingly going to your death, being passionate about your cause and willing to die for it. That just does not fit the profile of someone who's come up with a story, concocted a story, and made it up about Jesus rising from the dead. And by the way, it also doesn't account for the appearances of the risen Christ, unless you want to say that part of the lie was not only that Jesus rose from the dead, but the other part of the lie is, and we saw him. But here you're going to have to deal with another problem, because we have lots of witnesses who said they saw him. So now, this is not one person making up a story. This is a lot of people making up the same story. And you know what we call that today? We call that a conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theories are not really respected very much. You can go on the internet and find heaps of conspiracy theories, but sensible people don't take them seriously, right? They tend to be considered to be fantasy. So to have this conspiracy theory that literally hundreds of people made up the same lie, and somehow, even though they all knew that they were deceiving the world, they all knew that it was a lie, but somehow they never leaked the fact that it was a lie and nobody ever caught them out on it and so on. Okay, come on, that's a conspiracy theory which is not really going to do the job for us. So another big red cross. Now, we move on to the mythology theories. These are interesting. So again, there's two versions of these. One is that there were lots of resurrection myths in the ancient world, and the resurrection of Christ is just one more resurrection myth, right? We've seen it in lots of other cultures. We don't take any of the other resurrection myths seriously. Why should we take the resurrection myth of Christ seriously? This has been a very popular one, which is why it's sort of low down in my list, although there's one more that's even more popular. When you actually look at the details, this one doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Number one, there are huge differences between ancient resurrection myths and even the apocryphal accounts of the resurrection of Jesus himself, right? The ones that didn't make it into the Bible. Put all of those in one basket, and then you have the accounts of Jesus' resurrection, which for many reasons is unique and in many ways not comparable to those other resurrection myths. Right? So what this argument is saying is that the story of the resurrection of Christ belongs to a particular genre. And what I'm suggesting is that it doesn't. It belongs to a very different genre. And you can tell that from all the details that we see. So let me give you some examples. One, the fine details, the very practical details that are involved. In other ancient myths, you just have like a story, because it's made up, right? It's something that people have made up. They don't go into details like, and then Jesus was fishing with the disciples and they didn't catch any fish and he told them to catch, to throw the net, and they give you the number of fish that came up, and things like that. Or that he sat down and he ate roasted fish with them, right? These are really fine details. You don't get that in your normal genre of a myth. And they're very practical details that don't really add to the story, right? They're not really doing anything in making you believe the story more in the sense of, like, this detail fills in an important part. If you didn't have this detail, then the story wouldn't make sense, right? A lot of these details are just there because that's what people write when they're remembering something they saw, right? Oh, and by the way, I remember the car was red. Okay, it doesn't matter if the car was red or blue or whatever, the important thing is the car crashed or something like that. But when people tell you details like that, that's generally a sign that they're remembering something that they actually saw. Another thing that you don't find in any of the other accounts is that the witnesses are named. It tells you these are the people who saw Jesus who rose from the dead. That's not a feature of the genre of myths. And they even say, and you can go and ask them, okay, here are their names, go and talk to them. You don't find that in a myth. Many resurrection myths are not comparable, right? It's very easy to make this sweeping statement. Here are all these resurrection myths. Christ's resurrection just belongs with them. But in fact, there are some really serious differences. So one of the ones that are used are the Emperor Augustus. There's a myth about the resurrection of the Roman Emperor Augustus, who was in the 1st century BC. But when you actually go and look at what that myth was, it wasn't a bodily resurrection. It's not a dead man coming back to life. What here is called a resurrection myth is someone claimed to have seen his soul rising from the flames up to heaven. Right? That's clearly a very different thing to a dead body in a tomb coming back to life. So they're not really comparable. And the few myths that are comparable all come from the time after Jesus. So the earliest one that is comparable, that has a dead person actually rising and coming back bodily to life, is the myth of Adonis, which is dated no earlier than 150 AD, more than 100 years after the time of Jesus. So this idea that the disciples just took a general myth idea that was going around in lots of cultures, and they just put Jesus as the center of it, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. One myth that is definitely earlier than Jesus is the myth of Osiris, the Egyptian god. And I've heard people talk, by the way, about Horus, because there are some similarities between Horus and Jesus, like Horus was the son of a god and Jesus is the son of God and so on. But the myth of the resurrection in this case is not Horus rising from the dead, it's Osiris rising from the dead. It's his father. So let me just list for you a few of the reasons why this is a different story altogether. So 1, Osiris is the father, right? Horus is the son. Jesus is not a father. 2, Osiris is a political king of Egypt, right? He's a god who's the king of Egypt. Jesus is not the king of anything. Osiris is married. Jesus is not married. Osiris is murdered, right, so that someone can take his throne. Jesus is not murdered. He's tried and found guilty and then put to death. Osiris is killed by his brother who wants to take the throne. Jesus is killed by a whole community who are jealous of him. His wife resurrects him, right? So Osiris's wife is the one who gathers the pieces of Osiris's body that have been scattered all through Egypt. She goes around and looks for them and picks them up, brings them back together, says a spell, and suddenly he comes back to life. Of course, Christians believe Jesus raised himself from the dead. The reason that Isis did that with her husband Osiris is because she wanted to have a son, Horus. So they say that Osiris had a son, posthumously, after he died, kind of thing. That was the point of him rising from the dead. Jesus didn't rise in order to have a wife and, have a child. And then Osiris, once he conceives Horus, he just disappears from the story, right? He's not important, because the story is not really about Osiris. The story is one where Osiris is leading up to Horus. Horus is the interesting one in the story, although, much is made of Osiris in other ways. But Jesus is the one who's the center of the story. So there's lots of differences there. They're not the same story. It's not just like the disciples got this story from the Egyptians and then they made Jesus the center of it. That, once again, that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. So we're going to give this one a big red cross too. But there's another variety of mythology theories. And this is the one that says, okay, I call this the life of Brian theory, if you've seen the movie, right? So there's this good man who goes around doing nice things, right? But he's a perfectly normal human being. He doesn't do miracles. He maybe says things that are interesting and nice and those sort of things. And then every time, gullible people listen to him saying things, then they take what he says and they twist it and they embellish it and they build it up into something much bigger. And then after he's crucified on the cross, they remember a few things, odd things that he'd said, and they take it and they turn it into a big, story about him rising from the dead. And of course, if you've seen the life of Brian, it doesn't really account for the appearances of Christ after he rose from the dead, right? Okay, so if people come up with this story, it doesn't really account for it. But there are other problems with it as well. So we know that the accounts of the resurrection are very, very early in the story of Christianity, right? Generally, the kind of thing that this theory is proposing takes time to happen. So, for example, you need for the people who are actually there to kind of die, because that's how you can get away with a story that's not true. If you're telling a story in a community where people actually were there and the story is wrong, the people will tell you no, unless everybody is stupid. So really, one way to sort of agree with with this mythology theory is to just assume that everybody was stupid, right? Nobody was clever back then. They were all just gullible and silly and stupid. And I think that's a kind of chauvinism, to be honest. This idea that we modern people are so clever, and back then they didn't know anything, and they couldn't tell fact from fiction because they were just so dumb. That's just patently false and very, I don't know. Anyway, I won't go further in that. clearly people knew how to think back then, right? We have the Greek philosophers, even before the time of Jesus, who run rings around a lot of modern philosophers. They were very clever people around at that time, and they knew the difference between fact and fiction in something that they'd lived through. We have primary sources, first-person witnesses, like St. Mark, like St. Paul, who actually saw the risen Christ. All of this was happening no more than 30 years after the actual events, when the witnesses were by and large still alive and still healthy. And then there's this idea of the tunnel period, which is really fascinating. So you remember we read a bit from 1 Corinthians 15, where St. Paul, we didn't read it, I quoted a bit from it, where St. Paul lists those 6 groups of people who saw Jesus. And Bible scholars are pretty convinced that what he was doing, he wasn't just like authoring that passage, but what he was doing was repeating a kind of a primitive Christian creed. It was a creed which, when they get together and they say, what do we believe? And then they have this kind of formula. This is what we believe. So I'll read it very quickly for you, because you can very easily see that it's in the form of a creed. Okay? He introduces it by saying, "For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received." Right? So he says from the beginning, I didn't make this up, this is what I have been taught. And then look at the structure of it. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose again the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Right? So this is a creed. The structure of it is the structure of a creed. And then he goes back to himself and says, then last of all, he was seen also by me. He's kind of integrating his own experience into what he has received from others, right? Now, creeds take time before they gel and are formulated and are promulgated and spread within the community. So this idea of the tunnel period basically says, if St. Paul was writing down a creed in the 50s AD, then that 20-year period is when the creed would have been formed, and it would have taken time, some years, to grow and spread and come to be well known in the community. So that actually gives us evidence that they believed in the resurrection of Christ and the appearances of the risen Christ all the way back to just a few years, a handful of years after the events actually happened. Right? This is historical evidence that that was the case. And a really good, interesting sort of comparison to this is the appearances of St. Mary, which incidentally was 1968, which is also 50 years ago. I think, I'm not sure if I've got the order right, but I think either Martin Luther King was shot on one day and then St. Mary appeared the next day, or it was the other way around. I forget which. But if you're interested, you can Google them and find out. But they happened like within 2 days of each other, which is really interesting. Maybe St. Mary cares for the oppressed black people of America, who knows. Anyway, if you're interested in this apparition, which has a lot of similarities in that St. Mary appeared to many, many people on many different occasions, and here we are in 2018, and you can still go and find people who saw St. Mary with their own eyes. If you want to do that, you better do it quickly, because if they were like 20 at the time, and now it's 50 years later, like they're 70, they're not going to be with us forever, so you'd need to do it quickly. But we're 50 years down the track from the event. We have St. Paul writing here 20 years after the event, and quoting a creed that goes back into that 20-year tunnel period. We don't know exactly how far, but certainly some years back into that tunnel period. So mythology theories are going to get a big red cross as well. to the second last of our theories, the hallucination or delusion theories. So here, this one says that the apostles were sincere, right? They weren't deceiving anyone, they weren't pretending or anything like that. But the problem is, what they thought they saw wasn't real. It was a hallucination, right? They thought they saw Jesus, but it was just a hallucination. You know, sometimes as part of a grief reaction when you lose someone that you love, I've had this happen to me, right? When my dad died many years ago, I remember on a couple of occasions like walking into a room and just having the feeling that he was in the room, or that he was going to walk into the room or something. And of course I'd immediately realise that that's not going to happen, and then I'd say, oh, well, you know, it would have been nice, but I know that that's not going to happen. So maybe that's what happened, right? That the disciples loved Jesus, they missed him so much, they were grieving, and so they thought that they saw Jesus, but in fact they didn't. So this is going to suggest that the data that we have, those three pieces of data, are going to have to be attributed to basically malfunctions of the brain. The brain just didn't work the way that it was meant to. It wasn't reliable. Notice from the beginning, this might account for the appearances, and it might even account for the conviction of the disciples. If the hallucination was vivid enough, and if they were gullible enough, then they might have really genuinely believed he rose from the dead and been willing to die because he really and genuinely rose from the dead. But what does it not account for? The empty tomb. If I have this hallucination, there's a really easy way to work out whether it was real or not. Go and check the tomb. If there's a dead body in there, then it was a hallucination. It couldn't have been real. So this is a major problem with it. Another problem is that hallucinations and delusions are often symptoms of diseases, right? We said they're malfunctions of the brain, and they don't often happen in isolation. Rarely does a person just have a hallucination. Like, there's often other stuff going on. And we don't have any evidence for anything else being like psychiatrically wrong with any of the disciples. And also, what we're going to have to believe if we accept this theory is that it wasn't just one person, but in one case, 500 people happened to have the same hallucination at the same time. This is stretching the bounds of credibility, right? Can you really have exactly the same malfunction going on in the brains of 500 different people? That would seem really weird. When people hallucinate, they see different things, right? Different individuals, because what you see when you hallucinate depends not only on what's going on in your brain at the moment, but it depends on your memories. It depends on your experiences in the past. Okay, is it really sensible to think that 500 individuals with different backgrounds, different experiences, different histories would all have exactly the same hallucination? However, there are some rare cases where a specific hallucination or a delusion can occur. So let's just clarify, by the way, I've been using both words, but there is a distinction between them. A hallucination is where you have a sensory experience of something that isn't really there. So it's like you hear voices, but there's no voices. You see a pink elephant, but there's no pink elephant, right? So it's a sensory experience. What we would need for this to explain the appearances of Christ is it would have to be a mass hallucination, many witnesses having the same appearance, and as I've said, this is, that's just crazy, right? That's just fantasy to think that that could happen. But delusions are different. So a delusion is not a sensory thing, it's roughly a fixed false belief. So you believe in something, and it's really hard to shake you out of what you believed, but sadly, the thing that you believe is false. And there are, in recent times, people have found problems with this definition of a delusion, but we'll just take the simple road for today. So an example of a delusion would be you're sitting and watching the news, right? You're seeing what's on the TV, you're hearing the words that are really coming out of the speaker, but in your mind, you are convinced that the newsreader is talking about you. Or you're convinced that they're sending a secret message to you. And you sit there and you think, oh, I've got to decipher this secret message. Right, so that's a kind of a delusion, because as much as you might want them to be, the newsreader really isn't interested in you, and they probably don't even know that you exist, you personally, individually. Now, we do know that if a person has a strong delusion, other people can kind of be conscripted or dragged into their delusion, right? And kind of come to be convinced to some degree of the thing that they are mistakenly believing. Okay? A famous example of this, or not that famous actually, is called folie à Dieu. I apologize for my French. In which a healthy person is very closely related or like emotionally tied to an unhealthy person, and the unhealthy person is having the delusion, and because of the closeness of that relationship, the healthy person comes to believe the delusion of the unhealthy person. Okay? Now, it's called folie à Dieu for a reason. Those of you who are good at French will know that the Dieu means two. And there is this is very rare, there's an even rarer condition called folie à trois, if that's the right way to pronounce it, which means three people. Because the clinical cases that have been documented have never been more than 2 or 3 people. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because to have the closeness of the relationship required for this to happen, people don't have that kind of close relationship with more than 2, 3, people at the most. So it does not account, this kind of thing cannot account for 11 disciples at the same time. Like if one of them was mentally ill and had this delusion that somehow they believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, it's not going to account for all 11 of them, much less for 500 people, many of whom probably don't even know the names of the other 450 people. Maybe they know 50 of the other group, but the other people in the group, but they don't know, all 500. So it doesn't fit the profile for this kind of delusion. Okay, what about mass hysteria, right? This is like large-scale delusion. I don't know, anti-vaxxers might be an example of that, right? Oh, vaccinations give you autism and they'll kill your children and so on. And then people write blogs about it and then, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then eventually you get like a large number of people who are convinced of something that's patently wrong. And by the way, I'm generally I hedge my bets and I'm very cautious in what I say, but please do not be an anti-vaxxer. That is really, really bad choice, because it's just wrong. Like the evidence is just incredibly wrong. But that's not our topic for today. Okay, could this have been what's going on with the resurrection? It's really interesting, right, this idea of mass hysteria, right, just people getting all excited about something. The fascinating thing is very, very few scholars, including scholars who, are skeptics, very few scholars have actually pursued this as a serious candidate. And there's got to be a reason for it. So here is a quote from Habermas's book, I think that is, I'm not sure. There are very few detailed accounts of this explanation. Of those who now prefer hallucination explanations, however, only a few scholars have pursued this approach in detail, while several other scholars simply mention the possibility or preference for the hallucination thesis. Right? Why is it not popular? Why is it not interesting to people? And there are lots of reasons to think that this would not have been the explanation for the resurrection appearances of Christ. One is, it is known that mass hysteria is less likely to occur among educated people, people who can think. Right? Educated doesn't necessarily mean I went to a modern university. Right? It means people who are good at thinking about stuff. And we know that there were intelligent, thoughtful people among the disciples of Christ. We know that Saul and Mark and John were all very educated, right? John in the temple tradition, Saul in the Roman tradition. Mark is actually his Roman name, right? So and he was reasonably well off. So there were fishermen who were uneducated and so on, but there were also some pretty bright sparks there. St. Paul, you only need to read his writings and the complexity of his thought and the grasp of language that he has, to realise this guy is pretty bright. He's not stupid. He's not the kind of guy who reads about anti-vax stuff on the internet and, you know, stops his kids from getting vaccinated. He's just not that kind of guy, right? And he's not the only one. Luke was a doctor, you know, etc., etc., etc. It also doesn't fit well with the wide variety of personalities and circumstances and the environments in which the appearances occurred. Okay, maybe it happened once that someone thought and then they convinced a few people or whatever, but St. Paul lists at least 6 different times when it happened with different kinds of people each time, and that's only a representative of the appearances we think would have happened and are hinted at in the text. Okay, mass delusions, you know, they're not like that. They depend on a lack of data. They depend on being able to get away with stuff. And when you have an appearance of a risen man happening over and over and over and over, that's just the wrong pattern. That's not how it works. And mass delusions rarely involve sensory experiences, right? The anti-vaxxer isn't saying this is something that I can touch or see or hear or something like that. They're just saying, I'm making a causal connection between the vaccination of a child and them getting autism, right? I'm interpreting the data. What these appearances involved is things like, come and touch my wounds, right? Sensory experiences. Come and eat fish with me. See the oil dripping from my fingers, right? Feel the heat of the fish as you hand it to me. These are sensory experiences. That's not how mass delusions work. Mass delusions are about ideas. They're about beliefs. They're not about sensory experiences. They tend to take a while to spread, okay? And they tend to sort of grow gradually. But what we have here is something weird. We have Jesus appearing for just 40 days, and then nobody after that says that he appears to them. If this was just people, you know, hearing the story and then wanting to have their own story so they can fit in and join in, you know, with what everybody else is saying, why doesn't it continue after the 40 days? Why doesn't it keep going? Why doesn't Jesus keep appearing for another 20 or 30 years? But he doesn't. He abruptly stops. And there's a reason given in the text, because he ascends into heaven. And after that, he appears once more, just to Saul. And that's the only appearance that happens after that. And finally, once again, I'll just repeat, although it might be a dodgy explanation, I think, for the conviction of the apostles and the appearances of Christ, it still does not explain the empty tomb. Right? Even if everybody starts to believe Jesus is risen from the dead, it's so easy to debunk that, right? Look, that's his body. He has not risen from the dead. So we're going to give that a big red cross. So we only have one theory left, which you can guess is the one I think. You know, again, since we're using the Sherlock Holmes thing, you know, when you have eliminated all of the theories that are improbable, whatever remains, no matter, sorry, what is it? Whenever you have eliminated all the, who knows this quote? No? Oh, come on. Oh yeah, it's something like whenever you have eliminated all the other options, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the case. It's something like that. Anyway, I'm going to have to go back and reread that. Okay, so it seems to be the only theory that accounts, historically speaking, for all 3 pieces of evidence. And therefore, it's the most natural conclusion given the fact that we actually do have a lot of historical evidence about the resurrection. It only fails if you think that miracles can't happen. So this is the issue that I raised at the beginning, right? All of this historical investigation is all very good. But if miracles can't happen, then I'm sorry, you must be misinterpreting the evidence, because miracles can't happen. So to finish off, let's just deal with this objection. Can we be certain that miracles can never happen? The only way you could be certain that miracles can never happen is to be able to observe every single event that ever happened from the beginning of the universe to the end of the universe and confirm that none of those events was a miracle. That's the only way you could be certain that miracles can never happen. Even the argument that says, well, I've never seen a miracle, doesn't really cut it. I've never seen an Eskimo. I genuinely haven't. I've seen actors who are dressed up in Eskimo clothes, but I have never seen an Eskimo. It would be crazy for me to say, because I have never seen an Eskimo, therefore Eskimos do not exist. It would be crazy for us to say, because none of us in the whole history of humanity have ever seen an alien, therefore aliens don't exist. Right? That would be crazy, because we haven't seen enough. So the argument from we've never seen, it makes you lean towards a conclusion, right? Because I've never seen it, I can lean towards the idea that I never will and nobody ever will, but I could never, if I'm intellectually honest, I could never be certain about that. So that's the first point to make, and that's very important, right? Because remember, the argument here is the resurrection could never happen if we can be certain that miracles can never happen. If all I'm going to say is, I don't think that miracles can happen, then that's not really an objection to one miracle happening. And if miracles are by their nature unusual, if they are rare, then you should not expect to see lots of miracles. That would be weird if you saw lots of miracles, because that's not what they're like. So therefore, this is not actually a good objection to the idea that Christ rose from the dead, or not. Okay, there's more I wanted to say, but the time's running out, so I won't go into that. So if there is an alleged miracle, if someone says to you, a miracle happened, and can I tell you, as a parish priest, I have had lots of people over the years come up to me and say to me, Abuna, a miracle happened to me. And I apologise to any of you whom I have disappointed, but I am a skeptic at heart. And my first reaction is not, oh really, that's wonderful, let's go and sing a hymn, and praise God. My reaction usually is, tell me what happened, right? I want to hear the story. And I'm looking for the holes. And with one exception, they're very holy stories, with an E, not with a straight Y, right? I haven't been convinced of the stories. The one exception was something that I actually saw myself, which was actually in the house of some lovely Maronite people, which is interesting because they're just across the road. And I think it was actually in this area. And they had an icon of one of their saints, Saint Maroon, that was dripping oil. And this was before I was a priest. And we went and visited the house because people were coming to look and so on. First thing that made me think this could be something to this, nobody asked us for money. Right? There's no money involved. So that's a good sign. And then I went and I looked. And it was a picture made of paper in a normal sort of picture frame, right? Just a skinny little wooden picture frame with oil dripping out of it, dripping down a kind of a cloth that was sort of attached to the bottom of it and into a bowl. And the bowl was full and the oil was dripping quite fast. And I made a point of hanging around for a long time to see if this would continue or whether someone sneakily comes up and, replenishes the oil or something like that. And I made a point. It wasn't stuck to the wall. They had it on a table and the icon was at an angle. So you could actually see right behind the picture. And you could see the thin line where the frame meets the wall, so there's no pipes coming in through the wall or anything like that. You can see I'm a skeptic, right? And you could look under the table. There was nothing under the table. It was just a normal table with 4 legs and there's nothing under it. Feel under the table. There's nothing there. I did everything I could to try and debunk this alleged miracle. And I came up with nothing. So I still don't know what to make of that. It's a really weird experience. But should I say, because that's the only genuine miracle that I myself have experienced? Should I say that, well, since I've never experienced another miracle, therefore I must not accept this as a miracle, even if I couldn't explain it, but I should still say, it has a natural explanation? Would that be the sensible thing to do? No, that actually shows a kind of prejudice. That actually shows a kind of closed-mindedness. That I'm actually not respecting the evidence that sits in front of me, the actual evidence that sits in front of me. And aletheia is truth, right? That's what we call these meetings. We're looking for the truth. So we need to respect the evidence that sits in front of us. So if the objection is, even though, historically speaking, like if this was a non-miraculous event, we wouldn't be having this meeting. Like I said, people don't argue anymore that there was a man called Jesus. But that's not miraculous. We know actually Jesus was a common name. There were lots of men called Jesus, and it's not odd, even if there weren't, that someone might come up with the name Jesus. Okay, nobody would question that if there is historical evidence for it. The reason the resurrection is questioned is, even though there's all this historical evidence that we've worked through, but it involves a miracle. And if that's your only reason for not believing in the resurrection, I don't think that that's a good and valid reason. I think that's a kind of a prejudice that that we need to overcome. We all have prejudices, and we all need to kind of overcome them. So in summary, there's lots of well-established bits of historical evidence that account for our three main contentions: that the early Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead and were willing to die for it, that the tomb was empty, and that they believed they saw the risen Christ. And the only theory that accounts for all of those three, or does so most fully and most appropriately, is the theory that Jesus actually did rise from the dead.